Okay, we were finishing up, I believe, Acts 24, right? And Paul's defense before Felix. And just by way of reminding us where we're at, we noticed there in verse 22 that Felix basically decided, he would, he didn't want to make a decision, he just put it off. And so he adjourns the proceedings, he continues the case, and says, well, I'll make a decision when the tribune, the commander, the chief captain comes down. And so he actually, even though Paul was still a prisoner, it says he gave him some liberty. He was more like a trustee. He was probably able to come and go some, but certainly under guard, and his friends could visit and so forth and provide for his needs. And then we noticed about him and his wife, the Drusilla, and we talked a little bit about their background, especially hers, pretty infamous background. Great-granddaughter of Herod the Great, you recall, that murdered the Bethlehem infants. And then niece of Herod Antipas, who beheaded John the Baptizer. And then the daughter of Agrippa I, who killed James. And so pretty illustrious or infamous family, I suppose, pretty bloody family. And we noticed how Felix had seduced her from her previous husband when she was only 16. And so not a real, what we'd call moral family. And yet Paul, as his practice, his custom, his habit was, anytime he had the opportunity to teach or preach the gospel, whether it was one-on-one or to a large crowd, he was going to do that. And so he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. And certainly these are things that perhaps in her background that Drusilla was familiar with, her Jewish background, but certainly as a pagan, Felix was probably not. And so because of that, when you start hearing about there's a creator, there's a God in heaven, and he's going to bring us all into ultimate judgment for the things that we do and say and think, and that we're accountable to him. And yet, he's provided an opportunity for us to please him and to be in fellowship with him. But all of these things caused him to be afraid. And yet, his conviction gives way to convenience, right? And that happens a lot because we're so pulled and so tied to and by the things of this world, by our own fleshly desires and wants, that it just provides too big of a challenge. And it was for him at this time. Go thy way, or go away for now. When I have a convenient time, then I'll call for you. It's just not a good time for me. Maybe later. I'll call for you. And it says he also hoped that money would be given by him, which of course, even under Roman law, a bribe such as that was a violation of the law. And so he would send for him often and converse with him. And the language there in the Greek indicates that it was, a cordial conversation that they had. And yet, again, we see his moral weakness in verse 27. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, and he was generally not in favor with the Jews, but wanting to show them a favor, he leaves Paul, even though he knows Paul's innocent. Nothing's been proven, but then that's a moral deficiency on his part. The administration of Festus is generally dated by commentators beginning in AD 60, although some recent commentators have pointed to some new evidence which they suggest might be as early as 56. But generally, this beginning point here is generally considered around AD 60. And Josephus portrays Festus in a fairly favorable light, a lot better than Felix was. And of course, Festus will play a role in God's providential plan to get Paul to Rome. So let's pick up there in chapter 25 and read the first 5 verses. Now when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then my Bible says the high priest and the chief men of the Jews. That's probably not the best translation. If you look at the American Standard, a New American Standard, it says the actual translation from the earliest manuscripts is chief priests. That is, ex-high priest and members of the male members of the high priestly family. And so those, and then some, prominent men there informed him, that is, accused, against Paul, and they petitioned him asking a favor against him that he would summon him to Jerusalem while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. Well, we've seen that before. Second time, they're going to illegally ambush and kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore, he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there is any fault in him. So he goes up to Jerusalem. He takes office, takes his position. And you can just suppose that, you're new to the position. You're going to be ruling that part of Palestine. Well, what would you do? What would a prudent administrator do? Well, you would go probably and go down to Jerusalem and just kind of take a survey of Jewish affairs and see what's going on, see what needs your attention. And so that's apparently what he does. And so he has this meeting with these chief priests and these leading Hebrew men. And it's interesting to me that, how long has it been since they last showed up to accuse Paul? It's been 2 years. And I know people like that, but I don't understand how people how can you hold that kind of anger and grudge for 2 years? Even if you thought the guy was wrong and should, move on, get over it. And yet these guys are still as angry as they were 2 years later. And so he obviously has been apprised of Paul's status. Because when they tell him, he knows about him. He says, no, I'm going to keep him. I'm going to keep him there, but you're welcome to come down and say what you want to say. The King James says there in verse 5, he says, let those who are, the King James says able, but that is the Greek word dynamis or power. And so that's why it could be translated those who are empowered among you, or as it says here in the New King James, which is a good translation, those who are influential and so forth. And so, those that have some kind of authority are decision makers, leaders, not just those that physically can make the trip. That's not what he's talking about here, and that's sometimes the way we read it if we read the word able in English. But no, those who are leaders among you. So picking up with verse 6, and when he had remained among them, now the King James and New King James says more than 10 days. I think if you read the American and New American Standards, the earliest Greek manuscripts say not more than 8 or 10 days. They actually say not more than 8 or 10 days. Not that that's a big deal, but just to point the difference out if you're reading an American Standard. Not more than 10 days. He went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. What is the significance of sitting on that judgment seat? Anybody? What does that mean? And there was a particular seat. But when he sits in that seat, it means what? Yeah, court's in session and his decisions are binding. It's not advisory, but he's going to make some kind of judicial decision. And so he sits on the judgment seat and he commanded Paul to be brought. And when he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints, the New King James says. That Greek word means charge or accusation, legal charges And frankly, the word complaint we still use today, but we generally use the word complaint in connection with what type of law. If I'm going to file a complaint, what am I filing? I'm filing a civil suit. I'm filing a lawsuit. That's what we call a complaint. So probably a better translation here is actually, some kind of charges or accusation. This is a criminal matter as far as they're concerned, not a civil matter. And so they bring these complaints, which they could not prove, exhibit, demonstrate. And it's interesting here, while he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended anything at all. But notice they laid, it says they laid many serious accusations, many serious charges. You ever known somebody that thinks quantity substitutes for quality? Well, and frankly, isn't that the way, it's kind of the way politics works, isn't it? If I say it enough, right, well, people will start believing it, thinking it, because people don't want to think too deeply. And so you just repeat it enough, and people accept it. And that's kind of the way these guys, that was their method. Well, that's true too. Yeah, maybe you can pile up a lot of small things, yeah.
He really is stirring the pot in a lot of little ways. Give him enough room and he'll start stirring the pot.
It's interesting here, though, that Paul answers point by point with three major matters of address. He says, neither against the law of the Jews, that is the old law. In fact, according to Romans chapter 1, what did Paul feel toward the old law? I mean, the old law was actually an integral part of what? God's plan for saving man, was it not? I mean, for using the Jewish people to bring the Messiah into the world. Paul had nothing. In fact, Paul not only had nothing, he had nothing against the old law, but in fact, the whole reason he was arrested was because he had been asked to prove that he had nothing against the old law. And you going into the temple compound with these guys and pay their expenses for their purification and all that. So he didn't have anything against the old law. And then he says, number 2, nor against the temple. Well, they accused him of desecrating the temple, but by taking a Gentile into the temple, into the part of the Jewish court that they weren't allowed. Well, that hadn't happened. So I hadn't done that. Nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. I didn't stir up a riot. I haven't disturbed the Roman peace. I mean, if anybody did that, it was the other fellas. And so he answered for himself. That word there is apologio. Well, I can't pronounce it, but it's similar to apologia. But it means to speak in one's own defense or defend oneself. And it's not an apology like we use the word today that says, I'm sorry. He's actually saying the opposite of I'm sorry. He's saying, I'm right here and I'll prove it. That's what he's saying. So he's not apologizing like we would, but he is giving making a defense. But Festus, wanting to do the Jews, typical politician, just like Felix in some ways here. He's afraid to buck the Jews. He knows these charges are not valid. He's not stupid, but he's in a difficult position. And he wants to do the Jews. The King James says pleasure. This is a good translation here because the Greek word is charis, right? Charis, from which we get our English word grace. And that's the way it's translated about 130 out of about 156 times in the New Testament as grace. But he says he wants to do the Jews a favor. Answered Paul and said, and it always seems like when Paul is standing before these guys, who's in control here? Is Festus? I mean, who does he look to for a decision? I mean, it's kind of weird. Well, how about this? It's kind of like he's trying to strike a bargain or a deal with a prisoner. Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? I'll tell you what. How about this? How about if you give me the okay, we'll go up to Jerusalem and I'll I'll be there so I can ensure your safety. So it'll be fair. And Paul's like, I'm not going back to that place. You can't ensure my safety. I mean, this is all contradictory. You know, and you're certainly not being fair, because if you were interested in fairness and justice, you would have released me. So, Paul's a Roman citizen, and he asserts his rights as a Roman citizen. So Paul said, verse 10, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. Well, that's pretty direct. For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there's nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, You have appealed to Caesar you shall go. Well, what Caesar is he talking about, by the way? Nero, 54 to 68 AD. And somebody says, the first inclination, of course, is, why in the world would any Christian appeal his case to Nero? Well, because at this point in time, Nero's not known as a vicious persecutor of Christians. And he wasn't for the first part of his administration. But that didn't show up until about the last 5 years of his reign, from about 63 to 68 AD. And many people believe really more out of a political expedient. Why? What happened? Yeah, he had a fire. He had a fire sale. Well, he had a slum clearing, really. And people were pointing fingers at him. So, what do? You point fingers at the strangest, oddest outcast in the empire that nobody likes anyway, or is, they're not sure about them. But at this point, at least, those things had not happened. And so Paul says, well, I'll take my case to Caesar. And by the way, you are too smart, Festus, to know, you know what's going on here. He says, you know very well I've not done anything. And by the way, you're not going to trample on my rights as a Roman citizen. And you can't make me go to Jerusalem. And as one commentator says, it probably sounds like here Paul's attitude is pretty defiant, pretty strong. If you're not going to run this thing right, then I'll just take it out of your hands and go somewhere else. Now, of course, the interesting side note is, as many times as we use in our discussion of capital punishment, is that Paul kind of through the back door does what here? What does he do? Paul says there are things that you can do that are what? Deserving of the death penalty. Isn't that what he says? He says, hey, if I've done anything deserving of death, I don't object. So, someone said, well, you can't be a Christian and support the death penalty. Actually, I don't see how you can be one and not. Because God has authorized capital punishment in every dispensation. Both during the patriarchal, the Mosaic, and the Christian. You read Romans 13 and this statement here by Paul. And so we live in a world that murders innocents and is proud of it and thinks it's a right. And then turns around and says, oh, how can you put to death that poor murderer? Strange. I don't see how you think. You've got to be twisted in your thinking to think like that. And go back to the Old Testament. When Israel borrowed from its neighbors and started sacrificing its own children to false gods, God said what? He said, you have filled Jerusalem with the blood, he called it, of innocence. And he says, you will be judged. That you can't live like that. You can't do that and not be judged as a people. And he said, this didn't even come into my mind. Now, I understand that's accommodative language when God says something didn't come into his mind. But he's kind of like saying, now who would have thought my people would behave this way? So he appeals his rights as a Roman citizen. And so his long-standing desire, if you read Romans chapter 1, verse 10, to go to Rome is going to happen. Although, in a different way than he had probably envisioned. And of course, once again in the book of Acts, it's demonstrated that the Christian has a right to use legitimate provisions of civil government for his protection. And in fact, God expects civil government to protect law-abiding citizens, Romans chapter 13. If government has any function at all, it's to protect the life and property of its citizens. So then he says Festus confers with the council. Now, don't get confused. He's not talking about the Sanhedrin here, but as most commentators believe, he's talking about his own council, chosen by him, probably a principal Romans that lived in the province there, to discuss the matter. I think the New American Standard actually says that he conferred with his council. And so I guess, to kind of say, well, what do y'all say? Well, he's appealed. We really don't have you don't have any choice here, Governor. And so, as some commentators think, probably answering Paul with some kind of attitude or sneer, well, you've appealed to Caesar? All right. You get to go. And it could be. Yeah, it could be. It could be one of two things. Either, okay, be careful what you wish for. There's one way to look. Sometimes we say that, right? Somebody says, well, okay, well, be careful what you ask for. Or, but number two, you're probably right. At some point, he's already indicated he's kind of tired of dealing with this or doesn't want to. Well, certainly Felix didn't want to, and Festus probably doesn't either. It just takes a headache off his plate because whichever way he goes, and certainly if he goes Paul's way, then he's going to have trouble with the people that he's supposed to be governing. And so, yeah, it probably does take some headache off his plate. So, verse 13. And after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice, or Bernice, however you say that, came to Caesarea to greet Festus. Or to, I think the King James says, salute him. Probably a good translation would be to pay one's respects. I mean, he's in a new administrative post, so they decide to come there and pay their respects. This is the second Herod to wear the name Agrippa. Agrippa the second, the son of Agrippa the first. Of course, Agrippa the first, the one who executed James. This man, Agrippa the second, would have been about 17 years old when his father died from what? What happened to his dad? Yeah, the worms got him. Remember that? When he made the oration and so forth. And that was not too long after James was killed. When he was about 23, Agrippa was granted certain territories in northern Palestine over which he ruled until AD 70. So not actually over the area of Jerusalem itself. But he would have been, quote, I guess, what would have been considered the last Jewish king. His headquarters were at Caesarea Philippi, and the title of king is accurate there. He did wear it. He had been bestowed that by Claudius Caesar, and been given also the oversight of the Jewish temple and the right of appointing the high priest. And so obviously this fellow would have been very familiar with Jewish affairs, and a good person from which to extract information if you're Festus, as we'll see. And then his wife, Bernice, together with Drusilla, was his sister. So, this is his sister. I say his wife. So this is his sister that he's got with him. At the age of 13, she's the scandal of Rome. I mean, this woman here. At the age of 13, she married an uncle, but had been widowed. Josephus says that when it was reported that she was involved in a sexual relationship with Agrippa, her brother, in order to squelch the rumor, Agrippa persuaded Polemo, king of Cilicia, to undergo circumcision and marry her, which he did because of her wealth. But that didn't last, and apparently she returned to her incestuous lifestyle with her brother, according to Josephus. And you'd think, well, that's enough. But eventually she became mistress, now get this, to both Vespasian and Titus. Now, who were Vespasian and Titus? First they were Roman generals, then they were Roman emperors, but they were father-son. So she goes from incest to having a sexual relationship with the dad and then the son. I guess whoever was in power and whoever had, the money and the juice, so to speak, politically. So that's her. So, at any rate, when they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him." Really, that Greek phrase there could be translated sentence of condemnation. To them I answered, "It is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face." And I can't help but think, as I read that, where are and where have they been? Who? Who's actually his accusers? I'm talking about the ones who supposedly know anything, but they don't. But who are the original accusers? Certain Jews from Asia. And we hadn't seen them since the riot. And has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accuser stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, which kind of leads me to believe that, at least on the front end, he was a little biased. I mean, he figured, this guy's a troublemaker and all this kind of stuff, but he's a little surprised when instead of hear about things that Romans really care about, they had some questions against him about their own religion. That word religion, I think, in the King James is translated superstition, but I think religion's probably, it actually means, the word there means, I think it's that word that means something about fearing of the fear of demons. But I doubt in talking to the king that Festus would have insulted him, so I'm sure he used a term more akin to religion rather than superstition. And about a certain Jesus who had died. Now Festus believes Jesus is dead, who had died, whom Paul affirms to be alive. And because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. It's not the custom or practice for the Romans, unless they see accusers face to face, and so I'm surprised. I'm confused. I thought this was going to be kind of a straightforward thing, and it's not. It's a religious matter. A.T. Robertson says that he detects a hint of scorn or disdain in Festus's tone when he starts talking about Jesus and, he's some guy that's dead. Maybe he said like, he's talking about some guy that's dead and he thinks he's alive kind of thing. Maybe. But I don't know which way to go on this. I'm going to have to send him to Caesar, and what am I going to tell him this is about? I mean, here's the thing. If Festus really wanted to do the right thing, he would have already done what? He'd have let him go, and he wouldn't be in this pickle, as we say. Now I got to figure out what to tell the emperor. I'm actually going to send him to the emperor, and I don't even know what he did wrong. Now, how's that going to make me look? But again, a little bit of spinelessness here. This Greek word, this is a little misleading the way the King James and New King James read, for the decision of Augustus. Well, Octavian, or Augustus, died in 14 AD. So obviously he's not sending him to Augustus, but he's sending him, I think the Greek says the Augustus. That is, the word there means the revered one, or you could say the emperor. But he's sending him to the revered one, to the current Caesar, the current emperor, which of course would be Nero. And it's interesting, notice Agrippa, he's interested in this. The Greek indicates that it's something like this. He's saying something like this. As you were talking about this, I was kind of wishing, I'd like to hear this guy. By the way, this word for hear is the word diagnosis, to hear thoroughly. He wanted to diagnose, I guess, if you will, the apostles' teaching. And of course, Agrippa was acquainted, I'm sure, with the Christian way, being in his position. And more than likely, or very possibly, he'd heard of Paul. So guess what? I get to hear this well-known character. So appears to be some pretty good curiosity or interest here on the part of Agrippa. Next day, excitement in the air. Festus says, tomorrow you shall hear him, and this is going to be a big deal. So the next day, verse 23, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp, that word for pomp is Fantasia. You ever watch that movie? Fantasia. It means a fantasy-like atmosphere. We get our word fantasy from it. It originally meant imagination, but eventually came to mean show or display. And so we got a big show here. Great pomp. And had entered the auditorium with the commanders, that is the chiliarchs, the chief captains, those that are over 1,000 men. I think it was one commentator that said, it was Josephus that said there were 5 of those large regiments stationed in Caesarea. So perhaps over 5,000 Roman soldiers were stationed there. But there's excitement in the air because not only you got all the Roman commanders, but you've got the prominent men of the city. At Festus's command, so they all come in with the great show and display, and they all get situated. And Festus commands, and Paul is brought in. So you got all these guys. You got the king and Bernice, and they're all wearing fine clothes, I'm sure, and some gold and jewelry, and everybody's looking dapper. And Paul comes in, no telling how he looks. He's just a prisoner in chains. And yet, the guy always seems like he's the one in control. And Festus said, King Agrippa and all the men who are here present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. That word literally, a loud volume. Frenzied, really. This guy's not fit to live. But when I found out that he had, listen to this. But when I'd found out that he had committed nothing deserving of death, well, if he's committed nothing deserving of death, why are we doing this? Why is he still a prisoner? And that he himself had appealed to the Augustus, the revered one, I decided to send him. But here's my problem. I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. Therefore, I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. Well, that's an understatement. And so he is treating Agrippa as the guest that he is. And he says, look, I'm going to have to file a document here before I extradite him and tell him what's going on. But I don't really know what to say. And so you've got this dramatic scene with all these people there and Paul standing there. And then Agrippa, he just, as the guest and the expert here, I guess, he just takes charge. Chapter 26. Then Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. So Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. Go back to chapter 9, verse 15. And Jesus told Paul that he would appear before who? Kings, right? He said, you'll appear before kings. And of course, Paul is an apostle, had the promise of Christ, all those promises made even during his ministry to the other apostles, that when you stand before these kinds of people, guess what? You don't even have to prepare. I mean, if I were representing a prisoner in this situation who I knew was going to have a hearing the next day, what would I be doing? I mean, I'd be frantically preparing, what's our defense and how are we going to present it? Paul can just sleep because the Holy Spirit's going to tell him, it's going to give him what to say. It says he stretched forth his hand. Most commentators, Robertson and others, see this as a dramatic oratorical gesture. And so then the question becomes, the details are so exact here. And certainly Luke was inspired, but it also makes you wonder what? I mean, he's talking about Paul stretching. And by the way, when he stretched forth his hand, you kind of wonder too, he's probably more than likely chained to a guard. So he stretches forth his hand. I don't know which hand, but there could be some clanking too, I guess. He stretches forth his hand in this oratorical gesture and commences his defense, that same word from which we get apologetics. But it makes you wonder too with the detail whether or not, sometimes you wonder, could Luke have been an eyewitness to this? He doesn't say he was there, but Luke doesn't tell us a lot. Luke is a very humble writer. In fact, we talked about how that it's very possible that Luke's brother was who? And yet Luke would never indicate it. It's very possible that Titus was his brother. So maybe he's there. I don't know. But you just kind of imagine the scene of all these important people standing there, and here's Paul in his chains, and I'm sure pretty humble looking clothing, and everybody is looking at him. I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, especially because you are expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently. Well, let's think about that for just a minute. I think myself what? I think myself what? Happy. What did he say the last time we saw him making a defense? I do this how? Remember he said cheerfully? So here's a guy that's been a prisoner now for over 2 years. Was beaten, almost killed, taken into custody. And he's been accused of something for which he shouldn't be a prisoner. And he keeps having to make his defense and live this way, and yet he continually says, I'm cheerful and I'm happy. And then it makes you appreciate the verse where Paul says, you know, I've learned in whatever state I am to what? Be content. I can be on top of the world or I can be in the valley. But as long as I have Christ, I can be content. All right, we'll pick up with chapter 26 next week.